Nesli Sultan, the last recorded princess of the mighty Ottoman Empire.
The Ottoman Empire, when women close to the reigning sultans, mothers, wives, daughters and consorts.
She was born into royalty, yet spent most of her life without a crown. Nesli Sultan, a descendant of Sultan Suleiman, was the last officially recognized princess of the great Ottoman Empire. While her ancestors ruled half the world, she was forced to flee from it twice. Unlike Hürrem Sultan, she endured exile, heartbreak, and one of history's cruel twists. What became of her? Did she ever return home? Why is her name still spoken of to this day? Keep watching, because the answers might just leave you speechless. The royal arrival through a dying empire. On the 4th of February, 1921, in the heart of Constantinople, just months before it was renamed Istanbul, a baby girl was born into one of the most powerful bloodlines in the Islamic world. Her name was Fatma Nesli Sultan. She was not just any child, but a direct descendant of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. Her mother, Sabiha Sultan, was the daughter of Sultan Mehmed VI, the last ruling sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Her father, Shehzada Omar Faruk, was the son of a caliph, Abdulmejid II. As a result of this powerful lineage, Nesli was a granddaughter on both sides of the two final rulers of an empire that lasted over 600 years. Never in the history of the dynasty had a single child carried such a symbolic burden as she was, by blood, both the daughter of a sultan and a caliph. Turkish tradition took its course as a way to mark her birth, and 121 cannon shots echoed across the Bosphorus. These were not just ceremonial blasts, but an imperial signal that had been used for centuries to declare the arrival of a royal heir. As the city held its breath, silver coins were distributed among people with little means of livelihood, and the Ottoman nobility whispered the birth of a child under the crescent moon, a good omen in palace superstition. Yet just beyond the palace walls, the world was shifting. The First World War battered and humiliated the empire. By 1921, the Treaty of Sèvres had broken the Ottoman kingdom. Nationalist sentiments were rising in Anatolia under Mustafa Kemal, who soon became Ataturk. The Ottoman parliament was getting dissolved, and the throne her ancestors once commanded was now shaking beneath the weight of history. Inside the Grand Yildiz Palace, little Nesli was growing up surrounded by gold-embroidered carpets, crystal chandeliers, and royal tutors. Her crib rested beneath domed ceilings. Her lullabies were still sung by trained servants in court etiquette. Her baby wardrobe was filled with silk clothing, while the streets outside were filled with a growing revolution. Nesli entered the world at a time when her family name still commanded respect across continents. Yet within 3 years, that same name marked her as a traitor to the newly created Turkish Republic. How did a princess born to such honor become a refugee before her 4th birthday? From palaces to exile. To understand the story of Nesli Sultan, we must first understand the long shadow that fell behind her. How an empire that once stretched across 3 continents became reduced to just fragments and memories. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had been the beating heart of the Muslim world. Its sultans ruled territories from North Africa to the Balkans, from the deserts of Arabia to the gates of Vienna. By the 19th century, that mighty heart had begun to slow down. The world was changing rapidly, and the empire could no longer keep up. Within itself, it was becoming a house divided. The central authority of the Ottoman Empire was weakened as provinces grew more rebellious, with local leaders amassing power of their own. Corruption began to creep into the courts. The Janissaries, who were once regarded as an elite military force loyal to the Sultan, had become an uncontrollable political mob. In 1826, Sultan Mahmud II had to massacre a good number of them just to regain order. By then, the damage was already done. The empire had also become known as the sick man of Europe, not by its own people but by the very Western powers that had once feared it. With that nickname came a dangerous reality that made everyone start preparing for its passing. The 19th century witnessed a flood of reformations known as the Tanzimat reforms. These were ambitious attempts to change all the institutions of the empire schools, the army, and the judiciary. Some of the sultans, such as Abdulmejid I, tried to borrow the best from the West, such as a new constitution, equality of rights, and railways. However, modernity came with a cost, as the empire needed to take on huge foreign debt to finance these changes. By the late 1800s, the Ottomans were no longer calling the shots. Their creditors were. In the background, some ethnic nationalism was also taking shape. Christian communities in the Balkans, strengthened by the idea of freedom from Europe and weary of Ottoman rule, began to rise. As a result, Serbia gained autonomy, Greece fought and won its independence, and other nations like Bulgaria, Romania, and Montenegro all broke away. Each of these losses chipped away at Ottoman pride and territory. During World War I in 1914, the Ottoman Empire entered the battle on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. The leaders at the time, known as the Three Pashas, Enver, Talat, and Cemal, believed this alliance could restore the empire's former strength. Instead, it led to more disaster. By 1918, the empire was on the losing side, with its armies shattered, its economy in ruins, and its cities under occupation. The British had taken control of Jerusalem, Baghdad, and Cairo. The French were eyeing Syria and Lebanon. Even Istanbul, the glorious capital of the Ottomans, now had foreign troops on its streets. Then came the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920. This treaty detailed the proposal to carve the empire into pieces and assign territories to France, Britain, Greece, and Italy. Armenia would become independent, while the Kurds were promised a state. Even Istanbul itself was now to be placed under international control. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, signed the treaty, but many Turks considered it treason to the empire. At that very time, a new force was beginning to rise in the heart of Anatolia. A former Ottoman officer called Mustafa Kemal Pasha, who had led heroic campaigns during the war, began a nationalist resistance movement in Ankara in 1919. His message was simple: no more sultans, no more foreign control, and no more humiliation. This campaign began what was later known as the Turkish War of Independence. By 1922, Mustafa Kemal and his forces took control of Anatolia, while the nationalist movement grew stronger by the day. These liberated cities, like Izmir, as foreign occupiers, began to withdraw. On the 1st of November, 1922, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara officially abolished the Sultanate, and Mehmed VI, Neslishah's grandfather, was no longer sultan. 17 days later, he boarded a British warship, the HMS Malaya, and fled to Malta under British protection. This became the end of over 600 years of rule by the House of Osman. However, the caliphate remained, and the Turkish government, for a short while, allowed Abdulmejid II, Mehmed's cousin, to retain the title of caliph. It was a gesture meant to calm the nerves of the Muslim world, but that did not last for long. The last step was taken by the Grand Assembly on the 3rd of March, 1924, and the caliphate was abolished. With it, the remaining members of the Ottoman family were stripped of their citizenship and given 10 days to leave the country. They weren't just exiled, they were erased. Their properties were confiscated, and their memories, as far as the new republic was concerned, had to be forgotten. Over 150 members of the dynasty became stateless overnight. Scattered across Europe and the Middle East, they boarded trains with bags full of jewelry, memories, and tears. Many ended up in France, others in Syria, Egypt, or Switzerland, and their lives were never the same. In the middle of all this catastrophe was the little princess named Neslishah, who was barely old enough to speak. Carrying the blood of sultans, she was now forced to live as a guest in countries that once feared her ancestors. What became of her? That's where the story begins again. A princess without a crown. After the Ottoman dynasty was exiled in 1924, Neslishah Sultan, just 3 years old at the time, found herself growing up in a very different world. Her family eventually settled in Nice, France, a place far removed from the royalty of the Dolmabahce, or Yıldız Palace. Life in exile was not just a physical relocation, but a complete transformation of status, identity, and survival. Neslishah's parents, Shehzada Omar Faruk and Sabiha Sultan were both descendants of the last Ottoman rulers. However, outside Turkey, titles meant nothing, so they lived modest lives while struggling to maintain basic comforts. Their finances became difficult, and they relied on support from other exiled royals and sympathizers. Unlike the ceremonial life in the Ottoman court, life in exile demanded total adaptability. Despite the challenges, education was always a top priority for the family. Neslisha, along with her younger sisters Hanzade and Nekla, received a strong multilingual education. She quickly became fluent in French, English, and Italian, in addition to her native Turkish. Even more than language, she was learning how to preserve the family's dignity in the face of diminished circumstances. In the eyes of the outside world, Neslisha's family was seen as exiled royalty. In their country of refuge, they were immigrants. However, in their own eyes, they were still members of a dynasty that had ruled for over 6 centuries. This sense of a mixed identity created a strange social limbo where they were expected to carry themselves as nobility, but live without the privileges that once defined their lineage. By the 1930s, the financial pressures on the family became more intense. Omar Faruk, like many exiled royals at the time, saw marriages as a possible way to improve their fortunes. Marriage to them was not just a personal affair, but a tool for alliance, stability, and even survival. Shortly after, proposals began to arrive, especially from other noble and princely families in the Middle East, particularly Egypt, which still maintained its monarchy. However, like many young women of noble birth in exile, Neslisha did not immediately agree to these proposals, as she faced a conflict between personal desire and dynastic expectation. Her rejection of an early proposal from a wealthy and well-connected member of Egypt's royal family, Prince Muhammad Abdel-Moneim of Egypt, was met with tension within the family. At the time, Neslisha considered the match unsuitable due to the age gap and lack of personal connection. Yet, the pressures of their financial condition and her father's insistence on who she should marry eventually wore her down. For many Ottoman princesses in exile like herself, marriage became less about romance and more about preserving the family's dignity. The marriage dilemma. In the year of 1940, Neslisha Sultan finally agreed to get married to Prince Muhammad Abdel-Moneim of Egypt. He was the son of Khedive Abbas II, the last ruling Khedive of Egypt and Sudan. He was also a member of the Muhammad Ali dynasty, a family that had ruled Egypt since the early 19th century. The wedding between the two families took place at the Heliopolis Palace in Cairo and was attended by many members of the royal family of Egypt. The wedding was not just a union of two individuals, but a symbolic marriage of two ex-imperial houses, the Ottoman and the Muhammad Ali family. However, for Neslisha, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would mix her fate with the shifting tides of Egyptian politics. As princess consort of Egypt, she carried out ceremonial duties and accompanied her husband in many public functions. By 1941, she gave birth to their first child, Prince Abbas Hilmi, followed a few years later by their daughter, Princess Iqbal. Behind the scenes, Egypt herself was steadily moving toward a time of explosive political turmoil. The monarchy itself was becoming progressively more unpopular on a daily basis, and the palace was becoming increasingly at odds with its nationalist groups. In 1952, the Egyptian king, King Farouk I, was forced to renounce his throne during the Free Officers' Revolution, led by General Muhammad Naguib and Gamal Abdel Nasser. While a political space was created, Prince Muhammad Abdel-Moneim was appointed regent. For a brief period, Neslisha became Egypt's first lady and came a step closer to the heart of Egypt's fragile new political setup. Shortly after, she took an active role in charity work and social outreach and appeared frequently at public events. However, her husband's regency didn't last long, as his political ambitions soon brought him into conflict with Nasser's revolutionary government. By 1957, Prince Muhammad was accused of plotting to overthrow Nasser's regime and placed under house arrest along with his wife. In no time, the Turkish government intervened, requesting the release of Neslisha. Notably, Turkey's then president, Celal Bayar, directly demanded the release of Neslishah on the grounds of her Ottoman heritage and her now Turkish citizenship. His intervention worked, and the family was released, but not pardoned. They were given only one option: leave Egypt immediately. For the second time in her life, Neslishah was forced into exile again. She and her husband fled to France, joining her sisters and their families who had already been living there all along. France, which was a recurring refuge for displaced royals, became her second exile home. From the marble corridors of palaces in Cairo to the quiet, humbler neighborhoods of Paris, Neslishah once again had to begin her life again, displaced but not defeated. Return to Turkey and life in the past. The road back to her homeland was long. In fact, it took decades. After the founding of the Turkish Republic in 1923, the government passed a law in 1924 that exiled all members of the Ottoman dynasty. Men of the dynasty were considered especially dangerous to the now secular nationalist identity that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was building. Ottoman women, although seen as less politically threatening, were also banned. However, the winds of time seem to have softened hard political stances over the years. By the 1950s and early 1960s, Turkey was already evolving, and a new generation of Turkish politicians and citizens began to see the exiled members of the Ottoman family not as threats, but as a forgotten precious piece of history. In 1952, a decree made by the Turkish government allowed Ottoman princesses to return. A year later, Neslishah finally set foot again in Istanbul, this time as a Turkish citizen with a simple surname, Osmanoğlu, which translates to son of Osman. When she returned to the city of her birth, she was 42 years old. For Neslishah, simply walking again along the Bosphorus, breathing the air of her ancestors, and hearing the call to prayer from Istanbul's minarets was a homecoming worth more than gold. While settling quietly in Istanbul, she lived in a modest apartment in the Nişantaşı district. There were no longer palaces, servants, or opulence, but she carried herself with great dignity, always well-dressed, and was commonly found at cultural functions and charity events throughout the city. However, despite the distance over the years and the fall of her family's status, many people still recognized who she was. To some, she was a symbol of a past that had been buried too quickly, while to others, she was like a living museum and a direct link to the House of Osman. Neslishah's later years were marked by reflection and quiet resilience. In the few interviews she granted, she rarely spoke bitterly about her losses. Instead, she emphasized gratitude for survival, love, and the chance to finally be back at her ancestral home. Though she never wore a crown, Neslishah Sultan had something far more lasting: dignity, endurance, and the ability to carry the weight of history without letting it crush her. Her return to Istanbul wasn't just a personal victory. It became a national reconciliation and a necessary closure to compensate for the very turbulent century that marked the country's history. Her children made their paths too. Her son, Prince Abbas Hilmi, studied at Oxford and worked at the London Stock Exchange before returning to Egypt in the 1990s. Her daughter, Iqbal, remained by her side in Istanbul, choosing not to marry, and devoted herself to her mother's care instead. When Neslishah Sultan passed away on the 2nd of April, 2012, at the age of 91, the Turkish government did something unexpected. With her demise, Turkey didn't just lose a noblewoman, but the last living bridge between an empire that had shaped centuries and the modern republic that now stands in its place. The government gave her a funeral with full honors as the country's flags flew at half-mast, with state television having full coverage of the event. She was buried in the Ashiyan Asri Cemetery in Istanbul, overlooking the Bosphorus, the very waters she had been born beside, and the same waters from which she had been exiled as a child, not far from the resting places of other Ottoman royals. At the funeral, the then Turkish Minister of Culture and Tourism referred to her as a living symbol of continuity between Ottoman and Republican Turkey. It came as a rare acknowledgement. After decades in which the Ottoman legacy was often downplayed or ignored in public discourse, Neslishah's passing brought back a quiet public reflection about identity, heritage, and reconciliation with the past. 048 to 054. Her funeral was attended not just by her family, but by many political figures in Turkey, intellectuals, historians, and ordinary Turkish citizens who had come to admire her grace. To the nation, Neslishah wasn't just another descendant of royalty. Her very bloodline was the convergence of the last Ottoman Sultan and the last Caliph of Islam. Through her mother, she was the granddaughter of Sultan Mehmed VI, the last Sultan of the empire. Through her father, Shehzada Omar Faruk, she was also the granddaughter of Caliph Abdülmecid II. In many ways, she represented the final breath of a political dynasty that had ruled for over 600 years, and yet she never once held formal power. In her later years, she became a symbol of a different kind of royalty. Unlike the more politically charged figures of the past, such as Hürrem Sultan, who famously saw through the ropes of palace politics during the 16th century, Neslishah stood out because she didn't chase influence. They were both women of remarkable resilience who were placed at the center of dramatic historical events. Hürrem changed the course of the empire with her wit and ambition in her time. Neslishah, on the other hand, carried its memory forward not through politics, but through preservation. Before her passing, Neslishah published her memoir, Neslishah, the Last Ottoman Princess. This offered the world a rare look behind the veil of exile for the extraordinary princess. The book wasn't bitter, nor was it boastful, as she wrote with clarity and emotion. It focused more on her family memories, the adjustments to life in exile, and personal reflections on her place in history than on political grievances. She gave insights into not only her life, but into the disappearing world she once lived in. Unlike the rulers of the various empires, there are no towering statues of Neslishah in Istanbul, nor were schools or boulevards named after her. However, her presence still lingers within the pages of her memoirs, in the stories told by many Turkish descendants, and in the hearts of those who see her not as a forgotten princess, but as the final symbol of a legacy that stretched across continents. While history tends to celebrate conquerors and reformers, Neslishah Sultan earned her place through her unwavering dignity. Through exile, political downfall, and personal sacrifice, she bore the name of a fallen empire without ever demanding a crown. In doing so, she became something rare, a keeper of history. If one woman's quiet strength could carry the legacy of a fallen empire, what else have we overlooked in the shadows of history? If this story moved you, imagine what's still untold. What are your thoughts concerning all these? Let us know in the comments. For more captivating documentaries, ensure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Before you go, watch the other videos on your screen.